joining us from Asia, and good afternoon for the friends who are joining us from Europe. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and I am Director and Senior Fellow of the Indo-Pacific Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa. And it's a great pleasure today to be your moderator for what I'm sure is going to be a really dynamic discussion today, titled Global Japan. As many of you know, Macdonald-Laurier Institute has been placing a good bit of attention to the importance of the Indo-Pacific region and its nexus with Canada's own foreign policy interests. Over the past year, we've hosted events and given a platform to key thought leaders across the region, highlighting the key stakes in the region and outlining the imperative for Canada to bolster its own engagement. This session will be focusing on one of Canada's most critical partners in this arena, Japan. We've seen several times over the past year, and especially this past May, with Canada and Japan's 6-point plan for the free and open Indo-Pacific, how important and how crucial this partnership will be as a hinge to Canada's efforts in the Indo-Pacific. And we are delighted today to have a top cast of experts here joining us from Japan, the United States, Germany, and Canada to shed light on these issues. Earlier this fall, Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party elected a new president, Kishida Fumio, who also became Japan's newest prime minister in October. Amidst a range of regional challenges, including consistent provocations from North Korea and an increasingly assertive posture by China, this new Japanese administration faces a host of different challenges, not just in the region, but globally. Magnifying these challenges, of course, and Japan is not alone in this. This is something that Canada, the United States, and our European friends face as well, is this is happening in the backdrop of a global pandemic, which keeps worsening. The panel today will explore how Japan's foreign policy may adapt to these rapidly evolving changes in the environment, and indeed how Tokyo's connections are global in nature and not just focused on its immediate region. Indeed, I think we've seen, especially in the past 10 years, quite a sea change in Japan's leadership. This started with the Abe administration 2.0 from late 2012 to most recently, but this is continuing with his latest two successors. On that note, I'd like to kick things off and proceed to hand the virtual floor over to Ambassador Kawamura Yasuhisa, Japan's ambassador to Canada, who has graciously agreed to provide some opening remarks before our panel discussion. So Ambassador, permit me, you have a very long and distinguished biography, but I'm going to give a very abbreviated version and apologies for that in advance. Before coming to Canada, Ambassador Kawamura served as Ambassador and Deputy Representative of Japan to the United Nations between 2017 and 2019. He has also served in a range of senior roles in Japan's foreign ministry, including as Press Secretary and Director General for Press and Public Diplomacy. Ambassador Kawamura is one of Japan's most seasoned diplomats with overseas postings in New York, Delhi, Indonesia, Brussels, and elsewhere. He continues to be a good friend of mine and a strong proponent of strengthening Japan-Canada relations, both on the official track, but also through his robust and keen engagement with public policy institutes such as MLI. And we are eminently grateful for that, Ambassador. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for organizing this timely and meaningful discussion. I'm delighted to deliver a keynote today about recent development in Japan's foreign and security policies. Prime Minister Kishida, as Jonathan kindly introduced, won a majority of support at the general election, which was held on October the 30th. Today, I will first elaborate on Prime Minister Kishida's priorities in foreign and security policies, and then explain Japan-Canada cooperation towards the realization of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Free and open Indo-Pacific is also one of Prime Minister Kishida's foreign and security policy priorities. In Prime Minister's inaugural address, Prime Minister Kishida made clear that his foreign and security policies are his administration's key policies. Prime Minister prioritizes in three areas. Firstly, to defend the universal values of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Such values and the rule-based international order, which have been fundamental to the peace and security and prosperity of the world, face severe challenges today, including unilateral attempts to change the status quo by the use of force. It is necessary to vigorously promote the free and open Indo-Pacific in cooperation with allies and with like-minded partners and countries. Not only Japan, but also the United States, Australia, India, the European Union, and its member countries, as well as ASEAN, have their own strategies or visions targeting the Indo-Pacific. Japan will continue to work with our allies and with like-minded friends to realize a free and open Indo-Pacific. Secondly, Prime Minister Kishida is determined to safeguard the peace and stability of Japan. The security environment surrounding Japan has become increasingly severe, with frequent intrusions in territorial waters by vessels of foreign governments and attempts to change the status quo by international allies. Unlawful ways, such as through the use of force. Nuclear missile development by North Korea, which is against the United Nations Security Council resolutions, has worsened the situation. It is necessary for Japan to engage in reinforcement of defense capabilities, including territorial land, waters, airspace, and missile defense capabilities, and at the same time to cooperate with allies and like-minded friends for the peace and stability of the Indo-Pacific. The abductions issued by North Korea, which affects the sovereignty of Japan and the lives and safety of Japanese nationals, is one of the highest priority issues for Prime Minister Kishida. At least 12 out of 17 Japanese nationals abducted by North Korea in 1970s and 80s have not returned to Japan. Prime Minister Kishida has committed to do everything possible to ensure the return of all the abductees to Japan as soon as possible. With new challenges faced by the world today, such as space, cyber, and economic security, Prime Minister Kishida made clear that Japan will revise and draft our new national security strategy, national defense program guidelines, and midterm defense program within a year or so. Thirdly, the Prime Minister is determined to exert himself to confront global issues. As a Prime Minister from Hiroshima Prefecture, Prime Minister Kishida will strive for a world free of nuclear weapons. With this ultimate goal of a nuclear-free world in mind, Japan will continue to exert a pragmatic effort to take a step closer to the goal by acquiring trust and cooperation from both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. Japan will promote global climate change measures. At COP26, Japan announced the development of major projects worth $100 million to transform fossil fuel-fired thermal power into zero-emission thermal power in Asia. While Japan and Canada share the goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2050 and a green growth strategy, Japan has also aimed to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 46% in fiscal year 2030 from its fiscal year 2013 levels. And furthermore, to continue major efforts in its challenge to meet the ambitious goal of cutting its emissions by 50%. Japan will cooperate with other countries in international rulemaking, for example, data free flow with trust, we call it DFFT, in the digital age as well. With regards to his determination for global issues. Prime Minister Kishida also will contribute to the international discussion to seek the so-called new capitalist economy, which would respond to the call for a new approach in the new era, along with the international efforts such as Build Back Better by the United States and the Next Age EU by the European Union. It aims to resolve negative aspects of the contemporary social economic system, such as slow growth of the middle class and the deepening rift between the haves and have-nots. Realize a social economic system focused on sustainability and people. Prime Minister Kishida will pursue an economic policy to achieve a virtuous cycle of growth and distribution. Science, technology, innovation, as well as the digital garden city nation, which aim to connect the rural areas to the world, are major components of the growth strategy, while the major part of the distribution strategy is strengthening the distribution functions for working people in both private and public sectors in order to increase middle class wages. Facing these aforementioned challenges in the foreign and security environment surrounding Japan and the world, it is necessary for Japan and Canada to enhance their cooperation. In this regard, it is highly welcomed that in their meeting last Saturday, our two foreign ministers, Minister Hayashi and Minister Joly, shared their views to advance discussions about the concrete details of the cooperation for the realization of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan-Canada free and open Indo-Pacific cooperation was first mentioned by Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Trudeau when they shared their views on the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific in April 2019. Then in May of this year, the two foreign ministers of Japan and Canada announced the 6 operative areas of cooperation towards the realization of free and open Indo-Pacific, namely, first, the rule of law, second, peacekeeping operations, peace building, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Those are the quality control of the international contribution to peace and stability. Third, health security and responding to COVID-19. And fourth, energy security. Fifth, free trade promotion and trade agreement implementations, including the WTO and CPTPP. And lastly, sixth, environment and climate change, as I have just explained. Minister Hayashi and Minister Joly's meeting last month followed and further developed Japan-Canada free and open Indo-Pacific cooperation discussion. Among cooperative areas, the highest priority is to protect the rule of law. It is worth noting Canada's contribution through Operation Neon, which is monitoring and surveillance activity for ship-to-ship transfer by North Korea to stop their nuclear weapons development and launch of ballistic missiles, any range of ballistic missiles. Ship-to-ship transfers violates United Nations Security Council sanctions or resolutions, as it is one of North Korea's means to earn cash. North Korea's ballistic missiles and development of nuclear weapons are challenges and threats to the world. It is the same for Canada as well. Japan and Canada have already started their concrete cooperation to protect the rule of law in our free and open Indo-Pacific cooperation. Programs to realize free and open Indo-Pacific should be multi-layered and inclusive. It is necessary to strengthen Japan-Canada cooperation in accordance with such principles. Today, we live in a world which faces increasingly serious challenges to universal values and the rule of law, which they have been fundamental to the peace and prosperity of the world. The world also needs to come with an increasingly severe security environment. It is unavoidable for our allies and like-minded countries, including Japan and Canada, to work closely together. Prime Minister Kishida and Japan are determined to lead such an endeavor. Working together is power. I reiterate again, working together is power. I'm very much looking forward to listening to the discussion today on Prime Minister Kishida's foreign policy and its implication for Canada by distinguished panelists from Japan, Canada, US, and Europe, who are all specialized and internationally recognized in the study of Japanese politics, foreign and security policies. Thank you for your kind attention. I'm looking forward to listening to the debate after this.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those really important scene-setting remarks and many sort of comments I have coming out of it, but I'll save myself on them. But very quickly, I think your scope of the different regional challenges that Japan faces, but frankly, and I think as you noted, these aren't challenges that are just faced by Japan, but they're faced by others in this region, neighbors of Japan, but also the broader region more largely, including Canada. So I thought that was very important. But more important than just thinking about those challenges was I very much enjoyed you actually discussing some of the options and ways that Japan is going to respond to these, number one, nationally, but also internationally, which I think both elements are important. And I'm sure our panel will get into both some of the ways that Japan nationally, whether it's through a new national security strategy, a new revised program defense guidelines, et cetera, how Japan might respond to some of these evolving challenges. But very much an important element, and I think because we have guests today from Europe, from the United States, and from Canada, is how this works internationally. And I think this very much ties in well with this theme of today's webinar on global Japan, is that these challenges, and I think as you ended your presentation very well on, cannot be dealt with in an isolation perspective or one country, but they need to be done in tandem. So thank you very much, Ambassador, for those very helpful opening remarks. At this point, I'd like to kick off the panel discussion. And I'd like to start the panel from the United States. So I'm going to move to Dr. Sheila Smith as our first panelist. Again, Sheila, apologies for abbreviating, giving you a Coles Notes version of your very distinguished biography. But Dr. Sheila Smith is a John Amaro Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. She's an expert on Japanese politics, as I think most people tuning in to this webinar are well aware. She's published significantly on this topic and is the author of a very excellent book. If you haven't read it, I do recommend that you pick it up, called Japan Rearmed, The Politics of Military Power, in addition to another very good book, Intimate Rivals, Japan's Domestic Politics and a Rising China. So Sheila, the virtual floor, anyways, is yours, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm delighted to be up north with all of you virtually. I'm looking forward to being up there in person soon, I hope. I thought I'd start my remarks today with just a couple of comments to add on to Jonathan's introduction about the two elections that we've just seen take place in Japan. One was the leadership race for the LDP, and then followed on by the lower house election last month. It's an interesting time for those of us who follow foreign policy, and especially the nexus between domestic politics and Japan's foreign and security policy. The leadership race at the end of September for the Liberal Democrats was fascinating for me, largely because it was a surprise. I think most of us expected, despite the coronavirus difficulties, that Prime Minister Suga would be in the race, but very quickly that changed. And we had a pretty full display of the up and coming leadership candidates for the Conservative Party in Japan. And that debate that they had, I think, was very expressive on two issues. One was on China and one was on defense and Japan's own security policy making. So again, for people like me, this was an interesting race because these issues were so much in the debate in the LDP race. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But now we have at the end of the lower house election, we have a fairly successful LDP race led by Mr. Kishida. And I think his cabinet has come out now with some new faces that are also interesting for all of us to watch as we watch the Kishida cabinet's development of its foreign policy. On the personnel side, we all know Foreign Minister Hayashi Yoshimasa here in Washington, D.C. He served as a younger professional. He served in our Congress, both in our version of the lower house, our House of Representatives, and as well as in an office of a very distinguished U.S. Senator. So he is a very well-known person in Washington and has sort of grown up, if you will, in the U.S.-Japan relationship. But he's also been a very strong proponent and interlocutor with China and has led the China-Japan Parliamentarians League, which is also a very important position for elected leaders in Japan to know and get to understand the generations of leadership coming to the fore in China. So Hayashi-san comes to the foreign ministry position with very extensive networks, both in Japan's relationship with the United States and with its relationship in China. The defense minister remains the same. Kishinobu will retain that portfolio in the Kishi cabinet, and you know him. He is the younger brother of Mr. Abe, but he's also been very forceful advocate for Japanese defense, the need for a rethinking process. And so he remains in that position. There are two other positions this time that I think are also interesting from the point of view of thinking about how Japan's foreign and security policies are developing. One is a new minister, a new portfolio, but minister without a ministry, if you will. But that is the economic security minister. And this is a space where I think Japan is going to be developing some interesting new approaches to its foreign policy. Kobayashi Takayuki is the name of the new minister, a younger man in his 40s, has a pretty strong political economy portfolio that he brings to the security conversation in Japan. And so we should be watching in the spring as the Kishida cabinet pulls together legislation that they're going to present to the lower house. Now, by economic security, the emphasis to date has been on Japanese resilience, supply chain resilience, those kinds of issues, as well as potentially thinking about technology transfer and some kind of government oversight of technology transfer. The last person and personnel position that I think is interesting here is Nakatani Gen, who is the special advisor to Prime Minister Kishida. He will be a special advisor for human rights issues. And Nakatani-san is a former Ministry of Defense leader, but he's also someone who has spoken out quite forcefully about China's human rights behavior and has been an advocate of a Japan version of what we call in the United States a Magnitsky Act, which allows us to sanction corporations and people responsible for human rights violations. So as you can see in these personnel picks, you've got some interesting new dimensions, I think, to Japan's foreign policy. I think Ambassador Kawamura, in his excellent remarks, alerted us to the fact that next year, 2022, there will also be a pretty full agenda on the security front. But we should be looking to that to happen in the fall after next year's upper house election. So that's, we can talk more about that in the discussion if you'd like. Let me say a few words here about the U.S.-Japan relationship, and then a couple of comments, I think, that are important on the China-Japan-U.S. triangle. As you know, the Biden administration began at the January of this year, and they came out very forcefully with their approach to the Indo-Pacific. They embraced former Prime Minister Abe and now Prime Minister Kishida's formulation of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Prime Minister Suga participated in the first summit of the Quad. It was a virtual summit because we were still in the middle of the pandemic, but that was followed in the fall by an in-person Quad meeting where you had the leaders of the United States, Japan, India, and Australia looking to think about ways in which they could act in concert to develop an agenda for a free and open Indo-Pacific. I had a senior Japanese policymaker say to me that how delighted he was that the United States had embraced the Japanese copyright for the free and open Indo-Pacific. But I think the real important point to make here is that there is, I think, more strategic convergence between the United States and Japan today than there's ever been, be it on the alliance itself or on this more regional, more activist regional agenda. So I think the Quad is another place, another space to keep our eye on. I think Japan is hoping to host the next Quad meeting in Japan, but again, the pandemic will determine whether that's virtual or in person. The U.S.-Japan relationship is very focused, as you know, on the China challenge, and I think that's another piece of this last year that was very interesting to watch. I imagine that Mr. Kishida will be a voice of continuity from Prime Minister Abe to Prime Minister Suga and forward. The 2+2 meeting, which is our meeting of the Japanese foreign and defense ministers and our secretaries of state and defense, they met very early on in the Biden administration and were very explicit about the nature of their shared concern on China, be it the human rights issues, be it the rule of law, the violations of the way in which the PLA is operating in the region, but also the larger specter of Taiwan. And so you saw when Prime Minister Suga came to the United States for President Biden's first state leaders visit, that the Prime Minister and the President very clearly added Taiwan to the list of their concerns going forward. Now, a lot of people like to look at the Taiwan issue solely in terms of a military challenge, but I think it's important to recognize that both Japan and the United States see the strains across the straits between mainland China and Taiwan as being a source not just of military tension, but also a source of disruption, as Ambassador Kawamura pointed out, in the way in which the Chinese are putting pressure on Taiwan, disruption potentially of supply chains, disruption of the economic prosperity, not only of the Indo-Pacific, but globally, but equally and perhaps most important, a challenge to the practice of democracy in the region and across the globe. So again, this is going to be a very difficult and tricky issue, but I think the United States and Japan are very focused on what the United States and Japan can do together to incentivize, right, Taiwan to reach out to its partners, but also to disincentivize Beijing from taking any overt action that would destabilize the region and challenge democratic practice in Taiwan. So let me say a couple things about China and then turn it over to my other panelists. The U.S.-China strategic rivalry is a fact. It is how our national defense strategy and our national strategy is organized. I think you can see in the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration a different emphasis on how we will approach this. But nonetheless, here in the United States, it is true that the United States sees China and the American public see China as an actor on the world stage that is going to be the most important strategic challenge to the United States and its interests going forward. The Biden administration has taken a coalition approach. The alliance first approach is the way I like to think about it. President Biden and his team are very focused on the way in which the United States can work not only with the Indo-Pacific countries, the Quad, with ASEAN, obviously with our allies such as Japan, but also with our European allies as well, to think about the future of our coalition that thinks about not only human rights and democracy issues, but also the economic challenge of China. I think you're going to see in the Japan-China relationship that this strategic rivalry will create new pressures on Tokyo, pressures probably that Japan will have some difficulty with, to be quite honest. Some of those are going to be economic, but we've got a couple of smaller sort of precursors here to keep an eye on in the year ahead. One, of course, is the Beijing Olympics. The Biden administration has decided to not send a government representative. I think, and again, the ambassador will correct me if I am wrong, but I think the Japanese have decided that they are going to send their minister or their senior minister for the representative for the IOC. So they will have somebody there, but they will have somebody who is a Olympics expert or representative. But I think in the first conversation between Foreign Minister Hayashi and Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China, Foreign Minister Wang Yi pointed out that next year is the 50th anniversary of the opening of the diplomatic relationship between China and Japan, and that he hopes that this will be cause for celebration. So there are some moments in this year ahead where the Japan-China relationship will also have to be will have to take definition in a way that recognizes the economic importance, but also the regional importance of that bilateral, and while at the same time communicating Japan's concerns about China's behavior. I think in Foreign Minister Hayashi, Japan has somebody who is very well positioned, both to gain the confidence of the Chinese leadership, but also to express those interests more broadly. The other challenge is obvious, it's been stated already, but that will be Taiwan. And again, here, this is largely going to be a challenge that is going to be posed by Chinese behavior, not by the United States-Japan alliance. But I think there is a sense here in Washington, at least, that we need to be ready in case China miscalculates, in case there's some kind of behavior that would impact the security of the Taiwanese people. So I expect that this is going to continue to be an important issue for the 2+2 coming up in January, but also in the longer conversation about adapting the US-Japan alliance to ensure that deterrence in the region is solid and strong. So let me stop there. I thought Ambassador Kawamura's point that working together is power is exactly the kind of language that we need, but also it's certainly the perspective from here in Washington, D.C. as well. So I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sheila. Excellent insights there. And I would agree. I mean, it's also the perspective here in Canada that the only way that we're going to be able to be successful in this region, and Japan is a massive part of that, is working together. So a couple of just quick comments before moving to Ellie. I really like how you mentioned the personnel changes, because when thinking about any bilateral relationship, and especially one as rich as the US-Japan alliance, obviously there's interests and values that really are at the core strategic rationale of that relationship. But the reality is that it's alliance managers and individuals that actually have to implement those changes. And the alliance always has been evolving, and it continues to evolve. And in order for those contours to be evolving in the right ways, those alliance managers on both sides are really, really crucial. So I liked your scanning of some of the new ministers. Hayashi as well, I think, is very key. And Nakatani Gen's new position, as well as Kobayashi's, I think are all very important and notable. And thank you again for your discussion on the China relationship, and in particular on Taiwan. I think this is a very interesting point that we'll return to later in the discussion. Kishida's own personal history with Taiwan, in addition to a former leader of Japan who continues to sort of be involved in the public sphere on a lot of these issues. He shall remain nameless. But the Taiwan issue is of critical importance, of course, to Japan, and that's an issue that we'll return to later on. But I'd like to move now across the seas, across the Atlantic Ocean, to our next panelist, calling in from Germany, Dr. Ellie Polkamp. So Dr. Polkamp is a visiting fellow of the Asia program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She previously worked as a Japan analyst based in Germany, and has had stints in Japan, elsewhere, has published significantly on Japan's foreign and security policies and the Indo-Pacific. Ellie, it's a real pleasure to have you. Thanks for joining, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's an honor to be here on this panel and to being able to discussing with you. And I will try to give you a short overview on where Japan-EU relations are standing at the moment, and where I see the Kishida administration prioritizing in the relationship. So generally, the relations between Japan and the EU have developed and strengthened very positively in the last 5 years. Japan is one of the key allies of the EU, and both blocs have many things in common. Although they belong to two different strategic environments, they face similar challenges and are bound by a shared commitment to democratic and liberal values, and the rule of law, multilateralism, and a free and fair trade system. Both emphasize the value-based and normative dimension as one of the foundations of their influence and legitimacy at the global level. And for both, the economic aspect is an important component of their global influence, much more than the traditional military capabilities. On China, in 2019, the EU Strategic Outlook qualified China as a partner, competitor, and strategic rival. And since then, the gap in perception and approaches between Brussels and Tokyo has narrowed, though not closed yet. And there is significantly more willingness from Europe to engage and consult with countries in the region, such as Japan. And as the Sino-US strategic rivalry deepens, Japan's expectations for an enhanced European commitment in the Indo-Pacific have been growing. And Europe is in a new debate about China. Also, there is a major shift in EU-China relations, and Europe tries to look diversifying its partnerships to look beyond China, and both economically and strategically. And this is where, for the EU, Japan plays a key role. Both blocs recognize the central importance of the Indo-Pacific for their economic and security interests, and as a result, promoting the bilateral relationship in the Indo-Pacific has become one of the top priorities for the partnership. And Japan and the EU have a lot to build upon. They have the strategic and economic partnership agreement, and they have the connectivity partnership. And then in September, finally, the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy was released, which was a really big step for the EU. And now a more coherent and European strategy is coming into focus through a series of policies where Japan plays a significant role in the cooperation. Japan is described as a core Indo-Pacific partner for the EU, and particular attention will be paid to implementing and enforcing the comprehensive trade agreements with Japan and the cooperation on resilient and diversified value chains. And on digital partnership agreements, Japan is mentioned as a like-minded partner, and further negotiations shall be launched. And also in the promotion of data protection regimes, the area of free and safe data flows between the EU and Japan is very much highlighted in the strategy and given as a positive example. But also in the fight against climate change, Japan is the first Green Alliance partner of the EU within the scope of the EU's Green Deal. But also in the security field, the EU Indo-Pacific strategy described the project Enhancing Security Cooperation in and with Asia, which is supposed to cover counterterrorism, cybersecurity, maritime security and crisis management. And also there, Japan is mentioned as one of the pilot partners to kick off this project. Japan is not only important for the EU as a whole, but also on a member state basis, such as France, Germany, or the Netherlands, who all have their own Indo-Pacific strategies and guidelines, and they all have identified Japan as a key partner. And also from a German perspective, the German-Japanese relations have developed. We had the 2+2 meeting, and we have signed the intelligence agreement, which is a big step towards more cooperation. Although I believe there are plenty of areas where Japan and the EU should and could cooperate and coordinate action when thinking of possible priorities of the Kishida administration, I believe the primary focus will be in trade issues and possibly utilizing trade agreements to work on the enforcement of existing rules and develop them further in cooperation with the EU. But of course, also, as Sheila already said, on economic security, here the strategy takes a broader approach, going beyond concluding more free trade agreements and aiming to work towards resilient and diversified supply chains and stronger rules against unfair practices, and working with partners like Japan. And Prime Minister Kishida and the European Council President Charles Michel again confirmed this specifically in their recent telephone call last month they had. Then, of course, I see a focus on the connectivity agenda and digital connectivity, especially since the release of the EU's Global Gateway Initiative. And this includes digital alliances and cooperation in new technologies, whether it is in biotechnology, the ICT sector, or health tech, as well as supply chain robustness, in addition to the previously dominant sectors of transportation, infrastructure, energy, and resources. And then, of course, climate change as being the EU's Green Alliance partner. And although I always thought that the climate change issues and the drastic emission reduction was more on Prime Minister Suga's agenda, Kishida surpassed it at the COP26 with further pledges for Japan. And he said he wants to see Japan at the forefront of the global green industry. And this is definitely an area where I believe the EU can leverage its strengths and deepen the cooperation. And lastly, I also see I see possible approaches in niche areas like deeper coordination in the field of cybersecurity, especially in cyber diplomacy, norms and standardizations, and cyber ethics, but also in capacity building, for example, in the ASEAN states where Japan is already very active and where the EU could plug in. As far as one can judge at the moment for the Kishida administration, from my point of view, is, however, the clear focus lies on the US-Japan relationship. And although the relationship between the EU and Japan are very good at the moment, and we have achieved a great momentum, there might be a slight chance that they are getting neglected for more pressing issues. And I believe this also very much depends on how the trilateral relationship between the US, the EU, and Japan in the Indo-Pacific will develop. And a lot of things are going on there. And there are also a lot of dialogues on the Indo-Pacific between the US and the EU. So we will see how things will go. But I believe also, as Ambassador Kawamura said, now is the time to coordinate more rather than less in all kinds of directions, and not in competition, but I think complementary. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ali. Very interesting set of remarks, and I think the wide scope of different topics that you covered, I think, shows the range of different international public goods that European member states, in addition to the EU itself, collaborate with Japan. I mean, some of the key ones you highlighted: digital connectivity, climate issues, and I would add data as well into this basket. I would agree. I think it's very notable that several European member states individually have come out with Indo-Pacific approaches, in addition to the EU itself. And while you can have qualms with what's particularly inside of each strategy, the strategy itself is significant. Unfortunately, the timing was not ideal with the AUKUS announcement, not on the fault of the EU, but nonetheless, I think it's important that the EU is thinking much more closely about how to think about this region, and I would think many of them see Japan as the hinge point for this. One agreement, a pair of agreements that I think is really important when thinking about Japan's role globally and this entire rules-based order that we're talking about, especially in trade terms, is the EU-Japan EPA, so the Economic Partnership Agreement, in addition to the SPA that's attached to it. Often there's so much tension on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and probably I'll pester you all on the panel about that in the future of the TPP later. But I think the EU-Japan EPA is also a significant element of high threshold, high ambition trade that needs to get a bit more attention as well. So thank you very much, Ali. Very thoughtful comments. And now I'll move over the Pacific to Ken Jimbo in Tokyo, who has taken on the latest shift. So Ken, I hope you're still awake. Ken Jimbo is a professor of Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University. He also holds a range of distinguished affiliations, including as a research fellow at the Cannon Institute of Global Studies, as well as the Tokyo Foundation. Ken is well published on many of these issues and appears at so many conferences that I assume that you're calling, Ken, because I see you at so many of these events. So thanks again for joining us late at night there in Tokyo, and the virtual floor is yours, Ken.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for inviting me to this very exciting gathering. And it's not bad at all, staying up late at night in order to have a good connection with all of you. So I would like to start by laying out the broader strategic challenges that Japan faces today and try to connect them to Kishida administration's foreign policy agenda. And let me simplify by focusing three major aspects. And I think I will focus more on the divergent aspect rather than lots of cheering up aspect that the previous speakers generously offered to the perspective of Japan in its relation to Canada, United States, and also European affairs. So first, it has to be coined by the U.S.-China strategic competition as a structural level, and then breaking down to the next regional level into the each bilateral relations that Tokyo faces with our neighbors, and finally the growing policy attention paid for the economic security domain, has already been coined by Sheila. On the structural level, we observe there has been a growing confidence for the part of Beijing to militarily deny access of the U.S. Intervention in the Near Sea, inside so-called the First Island chain. The formula of deterrence and response in each of those crises in Asia that involves North Korea, Taiwan, or South China Sea, those are dynamically affected by growing Chinese capability vis-a-vis the United States. So that the previous format, where United States maintained the preponderance over the deterrence and defense over those scenarios, now have been significantly challenged by the growing capability of China. On the other hand, on the regional level, such time is clicking much faster in terms of the changing of the balance of power, where United States faces rather a long-term strategic competition over those decades. But for Japan, we perceive that the competition plays out in a quite a short term. That involves rapidly growing tension in East China Sea over the Senkaku Islands, growing kind of concern over the hypersonic missiles and those variety of the delivery technologies that the China has been playing out, and over those hybrid warfare that has daily takes place over the variety of the issues involving those the history, border, territorial issues, and etc. And because of these rapid change, these changes create the increasing amount of mismatch between what Japan needs to react vis-a-vis how much Japan is capable to respond by itself. So these are my second aspect. And the third aspect I would like to highlight is the tech competition. The rise of game-changing technologies and growing awareness for the dual-use nature of the tech platform will trigger by the alarm of the U.S. government over past years. And now the economic security has become one of the pillars in Kishida administration's policy priorities. So that all in all, Kishida's foreign and defense policy in 2022 will need to address these three aspects. And on the structural level, upgrading of the U.S.-Japan alliance, Sheila has already touched upon it, adapting to those new strategic environment and how much we can invest towards the future might be the key. So that the current U.S.-Japan Defense Cooperation Framework has been adopted since 2015. But probably during that time, we are aiming at looking at the more like low-end gray zone challenges and how we can really deal with low-end escalation control and how to connect the different sets of law enforcement and the military sectors all together. But now we are looking at the high-end operation over Taiwan and also with hybrid warfare and also those multi-domain warfighting capability. And with the new adoption of the U.S. Global Posture Review, and the Joint Chief has been now, exercising its own new concept of the joint warfighting concept, and those have to be the platform of the key platform how U.S. forces and the self-defense force needs to work together, and that those kind of investment levels and the timeline issue to how they can really innovate themselves in terms of how they really can fight in the theater have to be aligned together, and we need additional investment towards that. On the regional level, Kishida has been exceptionally clear. Although he's from the dovish faction from the LDP, but I think it has been not bi-partisan consensus, but it's a bi-factional consensus inside the LDP. But he has been exceptionally clear on the defense capability buildup, and by revising the basic defense document by the end of next year, which Sheila has already pointed out. That involves the considerable increase of the defense budget. And somebody mentioned that we are aiming for the 2% of the GDP. And I don't think that that's going to be the reality. But I think that just recent days that the Ministry of Defense have pointed out that the next midterm defense plan will involve the significant raise of the defense budget than the previous the pace, and that's going to be the case for next 5 years. And that involves restoring our missile defense capabilities. We have internal problems. I won't really get into the detail, but also to invest upon the multi-domain capabilities and also the potential adoption of our own long-range strike capabilities. And so that has become a huge political issue even during the leadership election in the LDP in past months. So finally, on the economic security, those measures include foreign investment restrictions, like what the United States does on the like a CFIUS framework. I think at the Japanese METI, Ministry of Finance, will try to inactivate more tighter screening processes for those foreign investors investing in Japan. And that also involves the export control of the Japanese products, of the high-tech transfers. And also that involves the stimulus for the supply chain reviews. One of the benchmark we just had was to invite the TSMC factory to Kumamoto. That also creates to have a more like a resilient supply chain for the semiconductor supplies to the Japanese manufacturers. So this still takes some time to somewhat converge the interests between what the government wish to achieve vis-a-vis those business sector interests, as Japanese manufacturing sectors have a high stake in their investment in China and deeply embedded in the Asian value chains that inclusive of China. Now that 15,000 Japanese companies are operating inside China, and many of them are making profits. And in terms of the investment return rate in the global scale, I think that the Japanese corporate sector has 5 or 6% average in the global market. But I think that they are making more than 60% of the plus return rates only for China. So that has been the reality of the Japanese business community who are looking at the potential Chinese growth into the future, and how much those kind of China plus or partial decoupling, smart decoupling, those debate may be converged as a policy agenda inside Japan under the umbrella framework of the economic security is still, I think, uncertain. And I think we have to have a heavy debate in the months to come. So I would like to leave them here and look forward to the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ken. A really insightful set of remarks. And I think you're right. Sometimes we have to step back and look at a sort of sobering analysis of the situation that we're in regionally. There's a lot of positive things sort of going around, I think, with regional cooperation in this region and some of the developments in Japan itself. But that should not distract us from some of the serious challenges that we are facing. I like your point in particular about the agency of different actors, public sector and private sector, and that sort of reminds me of when Abe Shinzo was engaging a lot with Vladimir Putin in Russia on trying to resolve their territorial dispute. And I remember when he drafted his 8-point economic plan and sort of approached the Keidanren and the private sector and said, okay, well, we're going to make this essentially a swap with Russia. For territorial concessions, we're going to give economic incentives. And I think the private sector looked at him and said, are you crazy? We're not investing in Russia. There's no regulatory environment. We'd rather invest elsewhere, even China. So I think it's a good point that there can be one thing that the public sector says, but one of the beauties of democracy is that private sector actors have their own say and their own opinion in this. And it's not something that can just be quickly dictated. So thanks very much. I think your comments on tech and other things I think are well taken as well. And maybe we can get into those a little bit more in the moderated discussion. If I can move on now to our final panelist, last but definitely not least, here in Canada, Professor Philip Lipsey. Professor Lipsey, I think, is well known to many here in Canada, focused on Japan issues, but let me have a very abbreviated introduction for him. He is an associate professor of political science here in Canada at the University of Toronto. He is also a chair in Japanese politics and global affairs and the director of the Center for the Study of Global Japan at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. So perfect to have you here, Philip, for a discussion on global Japan. Thank you so much for joining us. And the virtual floor is yours, Philip.
Well, thanks for having me, and thank you to Jonathan and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for hosting the event, as well as Ambassador Kawamura and the other panelists for really excellent remarks. One of the great things about being the last to go is I can abbreviate my remarks because much of the ground has already been covered. So I'll try to focus on some of the topics that maybe haven't been addressed at this point, and so that we can move quickly into the discussion and Q&A, which I think will be quite exciting. So I think I agree, broadly speaking, with the other panelists about the basic continuity between the Kishida government and the Abe/Suga governments. This is clear from Kishida's public statements, both before and after he became prime minister. There are some areas, I think, where Kishida does have strong foreign policy convictions in areas like anti-nuclear that can be attributed to his roots in Hiroshima, human rights, as I think Sheila already mentioned. But it's, in my view, not so clear that those personal convictions will be reflected in Japan's FOIP strategy. The Japanese prime ministers face both domestic and international constraints that limit the degree to which individual views and perspectives can be reflected in foreign policy. So it's not zero, but Adam Liff and I have an article forthcoming in the Journal of Japanese Studies that makes this point. But there are limits to how much prime ministers' individual perspectives can move Japanese foreign policy. And I think in terms of human rights, we've already seen an interesting pattern of it's in fact Abe who has been outspoken in trying to get Japan to take a much more proactive stance on the diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics. And Kishida has been stepping back and expressing greater caution. So sometimes when you're not prime minister, it's easier to take a position on these things. And once you're prime minister, it becomes difficult. So I think the basic theme here is one of continuity. I agree, broadly speaking, with the other panelists. I think one pessimistic note that might be worth highlighting, of course, is the border closures related to COVID-19. One of the major foreign policy moves that Kishida made after he came to power was to effectively shut down the entry of new foreign entries into Japan as a measure against the new Omicron variant. And I think this is an understandable policy response, and many countries may end up very well following this. But it comes in a context in which Japan has been closed to new foreign entries for some time and had just been opening up the door ever so slightly And so, I follow many Japan experts and people who work on Japan on various social media, and it's been quite remarkable the degree of negative sentiment expressed towards Japan from this group over this issue. I haven't seen anything quite like it. And it's understandable in the sense that for almost 2 years now, students, researchers who are interested in Japan or who've worked on Japan for their entire careers have found it very difficult to enter the country and pursue the kind of key relationship building that is the backbone of Japan's foreign relationships. And I think this is one area where perhaps Kishida being prime minister has made a difference, because if you look at what Kono has been saying publicly on this issue, he's made it clear that his preference would be for Japan to have a stronger quarantine regime, to essentially allow foreigners to enter, but to be subject to greater quarantine measures. And so it's plausible that if Kono had become prime minister, we might be seeing a somewhat different policy on this front. And connecting it back to the FOIP theme, after all, the free and open Indo-Pacific puts emphasis on open. And so, the ideological inconsistency between FOIP and Japan being closed off to the rest of the world, I think will increasingly become problematic if the policy remains as it is now. And so, although it's obviously a challenging issue for all nations, I do think Japan needs to begin thinking about how it can adopt a border policy that isn't subject to such drastic uncertainty and difficulty in terms of building up these key relationships. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about Canada-Japan cooperation on FOIP. As many of you know, and as Jonathan already alluded to, Canada is currently developing its Indo-Pacific strategy. And I think, although the ultimate vision obviously is going to differ from Japan's FOIP in important ways, I think Japan, as sort of a front runner on FOIP, will offer many important lessons learned, areas to promote, areas to avoid, and so forth. Japan is also a very natural partner for Canada as it develops its Indo-Pacific strategy. They're both leading democracies, leading economies in the world, members of the G7 and CPTPP, defenders of the liberal international order. The key agenda here, in my view, is to build on the shared Canada-Japan priorities, contributing to a free and open Indo-Pacific region articulated earlier this year, and really hone in on areas where cooperation is likely to be effective and productive, and to also think about areas where interests are divergent and therefore cooperation is less likely to be productive. And in my personal view, I've worked on US-Japan relations for many years as well. Canada-Japan relations is in some ways more exciting because it's not just the usual suspects reading off the same talking points, which is sometimes the way US-Japan relations gets caricatured. There is actually a large range of promise and untapped potential in the Canada-Japan relationship. And I think developing this relationship to live up to its potential will be an important priority in the coming months and years. So I'll leave it at that and hope that we can have a lively discussion to close out the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Philip, for those comments. And I think you're right. The point taken about being pragmatic as a leader, it's a lot easier when you're not in the seat of the prime minister or president to make proclamations and policy advice. But when you're actually in that seat, and I think this has been very symptomatic of Japan's relationships more broadly internationally, but in precisely with the China relationship. I think that despite some of the challenges in that relationship, ultimately pragmatism runs many elements of that relationship. I think Ken just beforehand was mentioning the business relationships in China. And the reality is that Japan lives in the world right next to China. So its economy and security depends on stability in this region. And I take your point also on the exchanges of scholars and others, unfortunately not being able to get into Japan. I think most of us on this panel would empathize with this and very much would hope to get back to Japan as soon as we can. And I think it sort of it underlines the point that I made at the beginning, that while we're talking about a lot of these pre-existing challenges, so challenges that existed before the pandemic, whether it's maritime security issues over the Sankaku, or whether it's challenges in the Korean Peninsula, the pandemic has put an extra layer here. And not only has it accelerated some of these threats, but it's presented new challenges. And I think your point links back to Sheila's point at the beginning when she was talking about the importance of relationships. Ultimately, what drives these relationships forwards are personal networks and a patchwork. It's not necessarily just one foreign minister or one a leader who has certain connections in her history, but it's a patchwork of relationships. And I think this is really what sort of lifted the US-Japan relationship over the years, and a lot of different Western countries' relationships with Japan. So very well taken. So I'm going to kind of feather together, we're going to kick off the moderated discussion now. So if I can welcome all the panelists back into the virtual room. Because of time, and I want to get to some of the audience questions as well, I'm going to sort of feather together a couple points in one sort of big, broad question, which sort of it came out to me out of all of your different remarks. And this is sort of comparing or some of the discussions between the US-Japan alliance itself. So some of the focus, I think, as Sheila and Ken both mentioned, about how that relationship's evolving, how personnel is changing, the different sort of challenges and headwinds that are facing the alliance, versus some of the other relationships outside of the alliance, and how this sort of balance of attention, priority, and focus goes in the coming months on this. And of course, they're not mutually exclusive. You know, we've seen this through successive administrations, both in Japan and the United States, where they talk about network security or integrating the alliances. But I think one thing that I've noticed is that this networking of relationships largely has been with resident alliances in the Indo-Pacific region or Asia. So the U.S. treaty allies in that region. Of course, you know, one of the most common and logical nodes here would be the U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral, which has been struggling. And luckily, we don't have to spend too much attention focused on this. But also the Australia relationship has been another key one. But if we can get outside of the Indo-Pacific alliances and start looking, and I'm, you know, we'll turn specifically to Ellie and Philip on this, on countries that are our U.S. allies, have strong relationships, strategic relationships with Japan, but are not necessarily Indo-Pacific treaty alliances. And those would be several of the member states, NATO allies in Europe, and Canada would fit into this basket as well. We have, of course, a long-standing strategic alliance and relationship with the Americans, and a healthy partnership with Japan, but we're not necessarily seen in that same light. So where is that sort of window for opportunity for those who are sort of on the outside looking in? And also, you know, a thought that I've been sort of exploring and wanted to get your sense on this, particularly Philip and Ellie. Is there opportunity sometimes to be doing things not necessarily hinged off the US-Japan alliance? So I think often there's been this discussion of US-Japan X, you know, who's going to be the third or fourth leg of the trilateral, quadrilateral. Are there opportunities, for example, to be doing things hinged off the Canada-Japan relationship, or the EU-Japan relationship, or member states within Europe and Japan? I think this is a really interesting and sort of unexplored idea. And maybe Ken can touch a little bit on that theme, thinking about how Japan's done this. You know, one example I think about is the Japan-India-Australia trilateral, which is still existing and is not necessarily hinged off the US alliance. So with this sort of broad basket of questions, you know, maybe I can turn first to Ken in Tokyo, if you can kind of explore some of this and how Japan may sort of evolve its approach on, number one, thinking about the alliance, thinking about expanding that in trilaterals and the Quad, et cetera, but also sort of exploring this space that isn't always premised on the US-Japan alliance.
Yeah, that's excellent answer, and I think it's very hard to respond in a limited period of time. But I think the trends that we are facing here is the diversification of the Japanese diplomatic portfolio beyond the US. And given that there has been the emerging potential it is not only China is rising, but also rest of Asia, Indo-Pacific are all on the rise. So that the strategic portfolio that we see in 2030 are the sets of potential capable kind of alignments between Japan and those emerging economies in Indo-Pacific. There's a lots of potential that Japan needs to invest. So that creates lots of, I think, incentives for the Japanese leader to expand its strategic outreaches beyond the US-Japan alliance. As Jonathan mentioned, that started with the Australia, India, and also the upgrading a partnership with the ASEAN member states and also the EU and the European member states. Those have become I think, very important benchmark for Japan to spend more energy and resource allocations to those relationship. And the products, made up was the including the Quad relationship, and there has been a significant development over past years and how regularized our meetings are, including the summit level, ministerial level, and also to the military-to-military exchanges with the regularization of the Malabar exercises on the naval fronts. And also with the ASEAN, we wish to see a more upgrading of the mill-to-mill relationship. And because back in George W. Bush era, they are talking about the global posture review, like what Secretary Austin has been doing right now, but they're focusing upon the different layers of the strategic outreaches of the U.S. forces in the region with the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, and beyond, but with a strained relationship that the United States individually have with those Southeast Asian regions. I think Japanese engagement in those regions can be force multiplier. Once that the United States individually have a set, the sound relationship with them, Japan cannot be replacing the role of the United States, but we can be a force multiplier once that the bilateral relationship became much better. And EU is always the welcome. I think Japanese stance is the more engagement, the better for the European security engagement in the Indo-Pacific portfolio, not because EU can be immediate kind of, the responder and providing a deterrence over the specific issue, but I think it really implies how Canada can be a very important partner in this region, because we wish to make those pivotal issue to be more internationalized. Once China says that everything is domestic issue, no third party should be involved in that situation, and we need a growing voice. No, this is everybody's interest, and this is everybody's issues, and then that needs the regular kind of a presence of the EU, Canada, and those to be seriously engaged over issue of the Taiwan Straits, maritime safety issues, South China Sea, and beyond. Those are, I think, important. And let me finish by saying with a couple of issues that Jonathan has mentioned. One of the striking kind of a development that we had during the Abe administration is that Japan has expanded its own regional network outside the U.S. The participation that involves the economic domain, like TPP 11, as a CPTPP, and we are also the strong supporter of the RCEP. We were disappointed India was not part of it, but nevertheless, that was the first kind of FTA institutionalization that connects China and Korea all together, and the Japanese business community really appreciated on that aspect. So that I think that Japan perceive there has been a strategic kind of a net plus for being as a more like autonomous actor to be responsible in the regional order making, and being ready for United States to come back to those multilateral regional framework. At the same time, that will be a very important prerequisite for the United States to be more robust in engaging in this region, because that there are multiple layers of the issues that those regional player needs to do at its own end. So these are, I think, the overall outlook of what Japan has developed so far.
Thanks so much, Ken. Very helpful. Sheila, if I can turn to you next from a U.S. perspective on this.
Well, I was actually, as I was listening to Ken and to you and to Ken both, I was struck by, we're used to seeing Japan use its economic instruments of statecraft and use them effectively. And I think as Ellie and others pointed out, the trade piece of the Japan-EU was really quite striking during our Trump administration. When we were backing away, Japan was leaning forward heavily, and that CPTPP as well as the EU, the EPA there. I think Japan has been very adroit and very effective. What we don't expect of Japan is the use of the military as a diplomatic instrument. And I think that's where my book that you kindly mentioned focuses in a little bit on that. But Ken's points are also very valid here, that Japan has done some really interesting things with its military. And I'm thinking here the coastal defense capacity building with the maritime states of ASEAN, of course, right? Philippines, Vietnam, and others. There's you mentioned it briefly at the beginning, and the ambassador mentioned it also, engaging with the states that are working with the United Nations Command on the Korean Peninsula for surveillance of UN's sanctions implementation. Very important that Japan has really been catalytic with Canada, with Australia, and others in making sure that network is working. And again, the individual, and again, Ellie's remarks laid this out very nicely, but the individual engagement with the European countries, with the UK, with France, with Germany, in the presence operations, peacetime presence operations, which I think very, very important for the region, to sort of communicate that free and open Indo-Pacific is not just about the region, it's really about global norms and in the maritime space. And I wouldn't forget the Pacific nations, the Pacific Island nations. Very smart outreach to New Zealand, to Australia, to Indonesia, to work with their stakeholders in the Pacific Island on climate resilience and disaster relief, but of course also very quietly demonstrating presence in that region as well. So I think Japan's diplomacy of late has been really remarkably effective in articulating Japanese interests quietly, in a peacetime presence manner in terms of the military, but very, very effective messaging.
Thanks, Sheila. Yeah, I would agree. And I mean, one of the interesting things about thinking about when Japan, even when Abe Shinzo sort of outlined his approach to the free and open Indo-Pacific, I think many people forget that was outlined in Africa, in Kenya at TCAD, and Japan's sort of engagement in Africa. And much of that's done independently, but a lot of that is also done in unison with India. Again, not necessarily springboarded off the alliance. So there are different ways, I think, that the US is working creatively. And both of the points I think that you made and Ken also made on the sort of different instruments that I think Japan works in and are necessary for pushing forward the free and open Indo-Pacific. It's not just the Quad. It's not just AUKUS that is running everything. It's a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and these are just a few pieces into it. You're mentioning, and I think Ken mentioned this as well, on Operation Neon, and making sure that North Korea is not able to circumvent UN sanctions, even though they still are. This is an important initiative from the Five Eyes, for example, and I think the Five Eyes also is playing a key role here in the region. Ellie, if I can turn to you next on this point. Grateful for some of your thoughts, and then I'll turn to Philip, and afterwards we'll move to Q&A.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. I absolutely agree with Jimbo Sensei and Sheila Smith, what they said. And from a European perspective, of course, the US-Japan alliance is a key pillar of Japan's foreign policy, but this does not mean that Japan is not looking beyond and trying to establish further alliances, and the relationship with the EU is a good example for that, because it was very much pushed from the Japanese side. Japan very much approached the EU, and it was we always were talking about the European pivot to Asia, but it was also the other way around. It was also a Japanese pivot to Europe, which was very welcome. And of course, Japan is trying to expand their networks, but this also has limits, because not every nation and every alliance can deliver the same thing. But I think this is not expected by Japan. And you said, Jonathan, that where are the opportunities, the windows of opportunities for the other countries who are outside the US-Japan alliance? And I think the key, and also from experiences from all the EU dialogues, is that what the EU did not make in the beginning was to clearly say where it wants to be what is their position in all these existing conversations, be it in the military, in the security realm, or be it in the geoeconomic, be it in the strategic realm. And this was very difficult for the Japanese side also to understand where does the EU exactly stand. And this is why they also very much focused on the member state basis, because, I mean, especially France, which has its own military capabilities and is willing to put them in the Indo-Pacific. And then we had Germany, who sent the frigate Bayern, which was more a symbolic gesture, but still it was a gesture. And then, of course, we had the UK, although not an EU member anymore. But I think it was much easier for Japan to approach the member states, because it was easier to understand where they are standing in this whole conversation, and rather than the EU. And now that we have the EU strategy and also Global Gateway, although it's a huge funding initiative and it's a lot about money, it's still a symbol that the EU is actually trying to take action to push things forward, and not just to have strategies and that strategies remain strategies. They try to go beyond, and although of course it's slow, but still it's a push. And I think and also to your question, where can they cooperate and where there are opportunities, I think the key is also to identify, to change the whole setting of thinking. We have the initiatives, we have many different initiatives in all kinds of different spheres in all the Indo-Pacific strategies, and but it's and a lot is in Europe, at least it's talked about if they are competing with each other, and we should take care that we have our own agenda and that we have our own initiatives. But I think it's more about identifying areas of complementarity among all these existing initiatives of the US initiatives, of the EU-led initiatives, and especially also of the regional initiatives, and try to find ways in between there, be it in niche areas. It doesn't always have to be the big thing. It can also be the smaller things, also be it in the digital domain, the technical domain, emerging tech. I think the way of thinking should change a little bit and start smaller than trying to achieve the big goals very fast. And I think Japan is also trying to do that in the way they are approaching all other states who have clearly issued their interest in the Indo-Pacific region.
Thanks very much, Ellie. I think you're right on that, and tangible, practical areas of cooperation and advice are well needed. If I can move to Philip for a last comment on this, and then I'll have one sort of question that I'll thread together from the audience before we finish. So Philip, to you, please.
Yeah, sure. I'll keep my comments brief because I think a lot of the ground has already been covered. But yeah, certainly there are a variety of issues where deeper cooperation would be helpful. I think the geoeconomics one that we discussed earlier is a key area. Maritime cooperation, reform of the architecture of international organizations. All of these, I think, are ones where Canada and Japan can cooperate without necessarily relying on the United States. Of course, the US would be an important partner as well. But I guess I would emphasize, from a comparative perspective, with the US-Japan relationship, it's just very easy to put on a dialogue with hundreds of participants, right? And I think one of the key things that Canada-Japan needs to work on is building up that bench of experts on both sides and relationship managers and handlers. I think this is an area, again, going back to the person-to-person connections and building that up gradually from an early stage, from students, institutions, right? You can point to, in the United States, the U.S.-Japan Council, Qualcomm. You can go down the entire list, right? It's a very institutionalized relationship in a way I think that Canada-Japan hasn't been and could benefit from. And just, sort of little bureaucratic bottlenecks, right? So one thing Canadian officials point out to me is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, deals with the US and Canada in the same part of the bureaucracy, essentially, right? Hokube, and, that leads to good outcomes at times, but if there's some key agenda item with the United States, sometimes it's hard for Canada to get in the door and get meetings and so forth. So, resolving those kinds of little bottlenecks, I think, could also sort of practically speaking, be a good way to get the relationship in a better place over the long term. But I'll leave it at that, and so we can open up to Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks, Philip. Those are excellent comments, and I can attest to this as a former bureaucrat that it's a double-edged sword. I think with this, sometimes you benefit from this. You have delegations that are visiting Washington, and they say, well, why don't we stop into Canada as well? It's right next door. But clearly, and Japan's not alone in this as well. I think a lot of different countries have their North American bureaus, but it does present some sort of unique challenges, I think, to try to carve out space and attention on this. And I think you brought up an excellent point, and I think very relevant for this forum, considering most of us, all of us actually, are in the civil society space, is the need to sort of nurture that discussion on Japan. And I would put a thank you to you and your center for the work that you're doing on this as well. And maybe we need to be doing even more work on this in Canada. But it's not just to nurture that discussion, but the type of discussion as well. And I think that's why I like how your center and even the intent of this webinar focused on global Japan. It's important to study the history of Japan, the culture of Japan, but also to understand the contemporary situation where Japan finds itself from a political and economic perspective. So I think that that is really important, and hopefully we'll be able to have a new group of experts on this. So we have very little time, but some very quick thoughts. We had a range of great audience questions here. We won't be able to tease into much of it, unfortunately, but one question that I'm going to sort of thread together here, and very quick sort of 1-minute thoughts, if you can, on it, is the idea of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific beyond necessarily the hard security. So we've had a couple questions here about the role of, for example, development assistance, other questions about the role of free trade. And I think Jimbo Sensei brought this up, whether it's RCEP and TPP. How do you sort of see this evolving? Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific going to continue to evolve this way, where of course security is at the core and will remain a key issue, but there will be this focus on whether it's vaccine diplomacy, whether it's on infrastructure, whether it's on data, etc. So if you have very, very quick hits on this, I'll start with Philip this time, and then move my way down. So Philip, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that Japan's FOIP is much less security oriented than the US interpretation of FOIP to begin with. But absolutely, development assistance, vaccine diplomacy, these are all areas that are core priorities for Japan, as well as the FOIP vision. And so I think it's part of this idea of geoeconomic strategy, that you can't think about security and economics and other domains as being separate anymore, that you have to think about it in a comprehensive way. And this is very much reflected in the way FOIP has been formulated, and I suspect will continue to be formulated.
Excellent. Ellie, please.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I completely agree. I mean, all these other areas beyond security are very much Japan's strengths. So there will absolutely be a focus, and they will try to promote it regionally and globally. Yes.
Thank you. Sheila.
Just very briefly, I think we talked earlier about state versus non-state actors, and I think it's important to remember that in the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, behind that government concept, of course, is deep engagement by Japanese private sector, multinationals and manufacturers. And I think in terms of the future looking ahead, there's the infrastructure building. I think there's such a respect for Japanese practice especially now that we see the counter in China, but the infrastructure of energy, right? The infrastructure of trade financing, the infrastructure of public health would be something going forward. That I think that's where Japan has an awful lot of opportunity to bring its expertise and the respect that people in the region have for its expertise to bear.
I think you're right on that, Sheila. And just a quick sort of postscript on that too. I think going back to Japan's engagement in Africa too. I mean, Japan didn't just come out of the blue and just invent this as an element of their free and open Indo-Pacific. They have a lot of history,
Right.
Not only on overseas development assistance, but also on infrastructure.
Mhm.
And I think those who are interested to see the direction they may go in the Indo-Pacific on this should look at the process that they've done in Africa and the way they've sort of transitioned a lot of their overseas development assistance toward private-public partnerships, precisely as you mentioned. So Jimbo Sensei, last word is yours.
Thanks. I think one of the FOIP-related policy coordination question that the Tokyo and Ottawa may have is how to deal with China's application to the TPP. And I think that is quite an important issue. And my personal take is that it's not so wise to close the door at the outset. And it might be a great opportunity to examine how serious China could be in order to reform domestically on its economic governance to be part of the TPP, and which are, I think, important, issue that we should not really lower the bar for China to accept those exemptions to be part of the TPP because its membership issues are always the sensitive ones. But it's a great opportunity to asking China to be part of the responsible player in the regional economic dynamics. That's one. And secondly, I think in terms of the economic security domain, it has been the trend that why don't we have like a responsible, like a more strategic value chain network among those like-minded states, clean networks on the tech side. And those are great ideas in the conceptual way. But I think that those initiative has to be positively evaluated by consumers. They are not, fond of having expensive clean networks, which doesn't really have a competitiveness over the China techs. And if that may be a serious competition, I think that those initiative has to be economically viable in order to satisfy the consumer demands. Those are, I think, the key of the success whenever we try to have such kind of policy framework into the economic realities.
Thanks very much, Jimbo-san, and especially on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. What a way to end. I think clearly we're going to need a part 2, 3 or 4. Hopefully we can do that in person. But I would quickly agree with you on this. This is one of the most critical areas. Canada and Japan are the 2 biggest economies. We hope our neighbor and friend to the south sometime decides to reconsider and rejoin this pact, but we are not holding out hope in the near future. But I agree with you that the future of this agreement and the character of this agreement will largely be defined by how we respond to China's application on this. So again, thank you so much to my fellow panelists for joining me today, and also Ambassador Kawamura for his keynote speech. Thank you to the audiences tuning in from Canada, the United States, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific. And we'll resume this discussion very shortly.